welcome back around the bonfire. It is a disappointing Sunday morning as we sit here as the Bears kick off and Chicago Fire have officially ended their season with a 3-0 loss against Philadelphia Union. They are swept out of the first round. I've got Tim and DJ here with me, fellas. No Alan, because I think the vibes were a little low today. No, I kid. Alan just had some personal things. Tim, DJ, how are we feeling some 12 hours on from the season falling apart?
The Bears are losing to the Bengals right now. What the?
That more or less sums it up. Yeah, I think it's a disappointing way for the season to end, which, from after what happened in Philadelphia, right? Like we knew the Fire's season was going to end one of two ways, of them lifting MLS Cup or in defeat. And I think that, we all knew defeat was probably the overwhelmingly likely outcome, but just some of the stuff in that game, which we'll talk about, I think made it worse than it needed to be and stung more in different ways.
Yeah, well put. We'll talk a little bit of news here. Like we mentioned, Chicago Fire officially eliminated from the playoffs, so it brings the 2025 season to an end in disappointing fashion in a lot of ways, most notably Chris Brady missing out. Kind of last second, we found out that Jeff Gall was told Friday night he'd be starting. Chris Brady popped up late on the injury report. And Tim, I don't actually know if we have any information on what exactly it was yet. All I've seen is lower body injury. Not sure if we got anything else from Greg last night in regards to Chris's health.
We didn't. I asked when the injury happened, and apparently it was Friday, not Thursday, as I'd initially thought, in training. And when Jeff Gall was informed that he would be starting, and it was Friday, I believe, afternoon or evening. So he knew going into the day that this would be his, MLS playoff debut. And, I just thought that may be relevant a little bit in light of some of the performance and stuff, just with the way that the goals went in.
During the broadcast, you could even see Brady on the sidelines, and he looked absolutely gutted that he wasn't playing.
Yeah,
I feel bad for that man.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that like anyone that had any ability to play whatsoever would have been in that situation. I think that's why we saw Zinkernagel, who said, he didn't have the best game because just of the physical situation he was in.
Yeah, interestingly taken off the injury report as well there, and to what he said, and you could tell during the game was not himself, and we'll talk about that a little later on. Last thing before we jump into the full recap here, game was stopped around the 80th minute after multiple announcements over the PA asking fans to refrain from doing anti-gay and racist chants during the game. It then continued on. John Freeman likely could have called the game at a certain point and apparently chose not to, I guess. Disappointing, I think, adds it's a really sour taste in the mouth for what was, a great season, all things considered. I think we can all probably agree on it hurts right now, but in the long term, that was a great year. And to end in such a way is really disappointing. Tim, you had an article out this morning kind of recapping some thoughts from the community as well as some statements from some leaders of supporters section groups. Anything else you want to add in here? I think we'll talk about it a little later too, but just disappointing.
It doesn't really reflect what the experience had been from, anyone that's been going to games throughout the season. And in some ways, right, like this is probably the game that had the most eyeballs on it for any Fire game of the season. And it's disappointing that sort of became a storyline. I think that's, not really what the vast majority of the people that were at the game wanted to see. And it just goes to show, I think, how close these things can crop up and just how ineffective some of the tools that, MLS and CONCACAF and FIFA have given to match officials and stuff like that to stop it, just because I don't think we've ever seen the protocol work successfully. And it certainly didn't Saturday night in Bridgeview.
The larger issue, right? And I think the one maybe fair point here is what exactly do you do about it? Because if the roles were reversed, right? Chicago's up 3-0. I don't think we see that happening, right? Maybe you still see some of it. There were some reports of not only, the very obvious chant that everybody heard, but also, some racist and homophobic things being yelled at both Andre Blake and Jeff Gall, which is concerning for a lot of reasons, and I don't mean to laugh. It's not funny, but it is a little, it's just unfortunate. I think we'll talk a little bit more about it later on, so we don't want to get too deep into it here. But I would say keep an eye on the site. We'll continue to update that article as we get more responses from different leaders of different groups and more and more quotes up for any pertinent info that may come along. Just to recap the match itself before we dive in a little bit deeper, Fire were not factors in the first half, and things just kind of fell apart as quickly as they started. Romani Kwame sends a ball back to Jeff Gall. Gall makes a poor touch, and Ty Baribo, makes a great play, scores on an empty net. Baribo then gets the brace off a header after Zinkernagel whiffs on a clearance, and Kai Wagner sends the ball across. And then finally, the third goal, Bruno Damiani scored off a blocked clearance that left Jeff Gall, 15 yards away from the net. No chance of making the stop. Somewhere in the mix there as well, Jack Elliott did earn a penalty kick. Brian Gutierrez takes, and unfortunately it's saved by Andre Blake. Not the best take from Brian Gutierrez. I'm sure he would tell you that. And then later in the game, second half, the Fire did come alive a little bit. They didn't play terribly in the second half. Brian Gutierrez puts the ball in the back of the net off a deflection, but it is called back for a handball, which is likely the right call, to be fair. I think the thing I took away from this game, and then we'll dive in a little deeper, was if two or three things go differently, this is not only a competitive game, but potentially one the Fire are leading in late, right? If Chris Brady starts, you take two of those goals off the board. If Brian Gutierrez can convert his penalty, that's one back for the Fire. And Hugo Kuipers was open at the top of the box with the ball coming into him and slipped and fell because the turf at SeatGeek is the turf at SeatGeek. In a game that was so one-sided, it feels weird to say that it really hung in the balance a little bit, but it kind of did.
Yeah. I think, just one other thing I think we need to recognize is you have to give credit to the Union for the game that they played. Like, I think they stuck to their principles in their game, and it worked out exactly the way that a lot of Union games have been won this year. And I can't remember if this was on the pod or if it was something that we were talking about afterwards, but Steve Cangliosi pointed out, like, this was the opportunity for Bradley Carnell to win his first playoff series, having not done it with the Red Bulls when he was an interim assistant. And he was very heavily hinted by leadership, according to multiple reports, that he would have an opportunity to be the head coach of the team following that. He saw the team into the playoffs after disappointing results when Chris Armas was in charge and was shown the door afterwards, and then didn't succeed in St. Louis's inaugural season in winning a playoff series or a playoff game. So, credit to him. I think this is a big moment for him personally, and I think vindicating a lot of sort of just the work that he's done since joining the league. He was an assistant. His first season as an assistant was, I believe, he joined early in the year in the 2017 season when the Fire lost to the Red Bulls in the playoffs.
Yeah, well said. And that was definitely the impression we got from Steve Cangelosi on the midweek episode preview that we did. He's, they were going to come out and their goal was to put their foot on your neck, right? And we saw that even before that first goal from Ty Baribo. Multiple people I'm watching the game with. This looks like Philly has this game. Like they were playing their game and they were playing it strong, and the Fire were struggling to cope with it. Now, would things have continued in that direction? It's impossible to say, right? But you have to think Philly came out with every intention of ending this game or ending this series, and to their credit, they did. That confidence they have is earned. They've got quite a chip on their shoulder, and they're not afraid to show it.
I will add on too. You could tell after the first couple of goals that the Fire were exhausted. They wanted to fight back, but also you could kind of start seeing like Gutman and Bombo were not as fast as they had been. Zinkernagel, obviously, the injury affected him well. Like, you could tell these are guys that have just played 40, 35 games in a season, and it's like you could tell, like, once that second goal went in, it started slipping.
Yeah, and I think part of that's psychological, right? Like, I think a big part of it is psychological. The Union have played a lot of games too. They made it, farther in the U.S. Open Cup than the Fire did. I really thought it was going to be their first competitive trophy, like knockout competition trophy. In club history, it was not. But you know, I just think that the air there was just such a sense of getting deflated after that first goal early, and I think when you're the underdog, which the Fire certainly were, right, as a number 8 seed versus the Supporter Shield winner, like the longer that a game stays at 0-0, the just more confident that you sort of are in a certain way. Now, I know that that's a little odd to say, given that the Union had allowed 35 goals in the regular season, and the Chicago Fire allowed substantially more than that, and it was the Fire's offense that really helped carry the team. But we sort of saw that play out in a way in game one. And I think just going down early, and then that just changed the game, right? Like the Fire needed to be protagonists, and the Union needed to sit back and absorb. And they are very good at just being able to sit back and in a like mid block or low block, or like low mid block, depending on the exact situation. And that's what we saw, right? Like anytime a Fire player got the ball somewhere in the final third, it like they would try to pass, and like the only thing they could possibly pass into was a deflection off a Union boot, or stuff like that. And it was instantaneous and it was fast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I think maybe the place we start kind of diving a little deeper, the question I kind of came back to after the game, and I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this, is how much of this game, we'll talk about Jeff Gall at some point, right? Okay, we have to, it's unavoidable. But I do want to approach the topic of how much of this game is on Greg. Right. Because I don't think that answer is zero. And I think Greg Berhalter would tell you that answer is not zero. Right. Couple things jump out to me. And look, I was a proponent of going to a back four, even with Sergio Orahel being suspended. So I'm not going to sit here and say that was the wrong decision. I do think, why are we giving Romani Kwame the minutes we're giving him? He had been a no-show in his last 4 or 5 games. And I don't think that's unfair. I don't think he's played well since the summer. I really don't. You also look at Philip Zinkernagel out there, and look, he's the best player on the team by a mile. But again, he said after the game, it was clear to all of us early on, he's not himself. Even when it comes to set piece delivery, he clearly wasn't himself. And I do think that's part of why play would break down in the final third. You don't have the one guy on the team who can really break defenses down with his dribbling and with his ball placement. And frankly, we've
seen Jonathan Bamba do that as well. We've seen Brian Gutierrez do that. Like it's not
that's
like
not really who they are, though, and I don't think that's like unfair to say.
I think it's certainly a big part of Brian Gutierrez's game when he's having a strong game. I think that he, as if we're like grading on a curve, which I don't know, he certainly didn't have the worst game for the Fire. I think he actually maybe had one of the stronger performances if we had to rank them 1 to 11, but that's not saying a heck of a whole lot, and again, like it just part of that though, really, I think goes down to the way that the Philadelphia Union have been really effective in playing their game in the series of, especially in game 2, like they were there. They made life miserable for any kind of creative play for the Fire. Right. And that's what the Fire needed. And so you're right. Like, set pieces then would have been the difference maker. That the Fire are good at set pieces. Zinkernagel not being able to really do it up to his full potential, I think, was part of it. But again, like it's not like there aren't other guys between the bench and that were in the starting 11 that can't do corner kicks and stuff like that. So I think that was also a choice that Berhalter and his staff made. That he was still the best option, even if he was not at 100%.
I will add on with Kwame. The problem with Kwame is, who do you start in place of him? Because you can't. Pineda's defensive. The only other 2 players you could kind of say, well, maybe are Kellen Acosta, who has been not really a factor this year, and Sam Williams, who, again, I like Sam Williams, but if you're starting Sam Williams in a playoff game against the Union, you're basically saying, okay, we're probably not winning this game.
Yeah, that's fair. Look, I don't think anybody was. Sam Williams makes the bench because Sergio Orahel is out. I don't think you expect to see him barring some kind of crazy turn of events.
Yeah, it makes sense not to have an empty spot on your bench when you have a body that you could put in there for sure.
Yeah, I don't know that I guess what I don't, and what I truly don't get, and I would love your guys' thoughts on this, In what ways is Romani Kwame better than Mauricio Pineda? Because I watched Mauricio Pineda start 17, 18, 19 games this year, and I just think he's a better player. I do. Like, I think in a game where you're going back to a back four, you can say he's not as good going forward, which is invalid in some ways. Okay, so you have a stronger defensive presence with two center backs instead of three. I don't see that as a big minus. Like, and frankly, what does Mauricio Pineda do really well? Big line breaking passes. He can put the ball on a dot. And I'm not saying he's perfect at that or the best player on the team for it, but I think he's better than that, better than Romani Kwame in that role. And you weren't going to break down Philly slowly. It did feel like you were going to need to get forward, hold up play, and then play for set pieces, which we saw at times. And that was when the Fire were most dangerous. That's when they won a penalty kick. It was a series of 2 or 3 corners in a very short period of time there.
Although that's pretty much the only thing the Fire had going for them in this game, right? And so, again, a lot of it is, game state of going down early and all of that. I think that when the game is 0-0, at start, like you look at things differently, like now I do think Kwame, in terms of what he brings, I think we've seen his ceiling, right, of him being a dynamic midfielder. I think the downside is when he has not been good, he's been very anonymous. And I think that that's why he was such an early sub off, right? Because his head wasn't really in the game. I think on the first goal, it was a kind of lazy pass back. I don't know if it was communication. It looked like he was almost maybe aiming more to pass the ball back to Joel Waterman rather than Jeff Gall. And if that was the case, it was a pass to Waterman. Waterman kind of like jumps over it to allow Gall to play it. And Gall seemed confused about the situation. Now, again, like some of that's like backup goalkeeper, right? 6 starts, 7 appearances on the season. Kwame, not a guy that got a ton of minutes over the course of the season. Joel Waterman, a guy that came, at the close to the trade deadline. Like if you're looking for a recipe for not having chemistry between guys, like that's more or less the perfect one. Not that I think that it excuses it from really any of the players that were involved, but I think the hope was that Kwame would be the guy that can launch a cannon, that can kind of like help control the pace of games a little bit. Giving you some stuff going forward. I think Pineda can do a lot of that too, but I think that he hasn't shown as much going forward. Although, like, to be honest, I think it wasn't a high XG shot by any means, but it's like the way that the game can be changed shot in, what was it, like the 49th minute or something like that, when he, it goes wide. I think that maybe a different midfielder or somebody else maybe gets that a little bit closer to target or on target, but it was a cannon, and like there's if it had gone off his foot a little bit differently, it could have been something that could have made the game a little bit more interesting for the Fire with, still a lot of time to play.
Look, I think the thing we're all beating around the bush a little bit is like this was far from a first choice lineup. If we're just being candid about it, right? No Sergio Orahel due to a suspension. I do think Sergio performs better and offers more than Kwame in that role. No Andre Franco, of course, who, you talk about a light that burns short and bright. Like it doesn't get much shorter or brighter than Andre Franco in Chicago Fire, right? No Chris Brady, no Leonardo Barroso, which just not a good game from Jonathan Dean. And I did feel like there were times where he was maybe hung out to dry a little bit, where that's just where the ball goes and Philly knows where it's going, but he still did not play to even his level, I think. And I do think, Leonardo Barroso, his passing, his speed, his attacking abilities, they would have changed the game, right? And so you do have to look and say the cupboard was a little bare in some ways. I mean, 3 substitutions, only 2 windows used. Greg left 2 subs on, in his pocket, right? But to your point earlier, like who are you getting off the bench that late in the game? Because Marin already came in. Outside of that, you don't really, and Barlow comes in late. Like you don't have a ton of other game-changing subs on the bench.
The only one that you could arguably say is Acosta, and Acosta's not really, he hasn't been that player this year anywhere near it.
He hasn't really gotten the chance to be that player, frankly.
To be fair, that's because he got injured, and then everyone else played better than him.
Yeah, I think that it is like, look, like I think that it's, I'm not sure that I honestly don't know the full situation of the Kellen Acosta, because it seems, I was talking to Matt Doyle about this a little bit during the game, and he was like, look, you can't really tell me, like, this is like not long before Kwame was taken off. Like, you can't really tell me that what we've been seeing from Kwame is worse than what Kellen Acosta would have brought today. And I mean, it would seem like the answer is that Kellen Acosta probably could have brought more. And then the question is why he didn't. And maybe for some reason he has fallen that much. I mean, I'm not really, breaking any news here, but I have heard zero rumors of any kind about like Kellen Acosta not giving 100% in training, of not being well integrated with the team, of having issues with teammates or coaches or any of that. And it would just seem to be the opposite of his personality for those things to be going on. And if anything, I've heard the opposite. I've heard that he, really has been integrating well with the rest of the squad and stuff like that. So like, I can't fully explain why we didn't see him. Other than that may have been a little bit of a message about the direction of where this team is going to be going in 2026 and beyond.
Adding on, Costa has not started a game since DC, since the 7-1 victory over DC.
Yeah, look, first of all, well put there, Tim. There's no possible reason that we know of outside of he has just been terrible at actually playing soccer in practice that Kellen Acosta is not on the field, but we haven't even heard that, right? What blows my mind, and sorry, I'll try and wrap this up because I don't want to talk about it forever, and it's not worth talking about much longer. Your point about direction of the team, we know for a fact Romini Kwame will not be a member of Chicago Fire in 2026. I mean, look, it hasn't been announced. I would be shocked. I would be shocked. He is not under contract. His loan is expiring. There is no purchase agreement. There's an option. There's no agreement. Kellen Acosta is under contract next year at a full max TAM. You're not just getting rid of that contract unless you use the buyout on him. And I don't know that he's the guy who most warrants a buyout. And I'm not, this is not a specific blame on anyone. At some point, Greg Berhalter needs to address it because it's crazy to me. You have a max TAM player who's competed and won MLS Cup. Your midfield is suffering greatly and you won't put him in the game. It makes no sense to me.
I have asked Greg several times. I tried to get it different ways. Including games where he came in and I thought had relatively good appearances in the limited opportunities that he had.
Good off the bench recently.
Well, so I've brought that up to him, right? And like now, what I was really looking for more than anything else, if I'm being honest, was just we really appreciate having a guy with his experience that we can draw on in the right moments, kind of just generic boilerplate almost verbiage about a player that came off the bench and made a difference. And what I got was an answer about how like game state was his factor and stuff like that and him looking good, which again, the only thing I can assume is that means that there is some kind of communication, and Greg has certainly tried to communicate things to other teams and to players, I think, through the media about Acosta's future with the team. And I don't know, I don't have any specific information to back that up. I don't know, how Greg is supposed to address what's going on because he, ultimately he's deciding on, he'll just tell us he's deciding on the best players in the lineup at that point. And that's that. And the other side of it, I guess, a little bit is in terms of the, director of football, Greg Berhalter, not head coach Greg Berhalter being a factor. I think that it's relevant to say he didn't negotiate the contract for Acosta, so it's something that he inherited. And I think that to maybe try to put a bow on this a little bit, I think what this series showed, the Philadelphia Union improved, I believe, 37 points from last season when they finished, a couple spots out of the playoffs to Supporters Shield this year, right? The Fire improved 23 points. The Union, did make a couple changes here and there, including getting rid of their best scorer and sending him to Columbus, which is the kind of stuff like they have done the ship of Theseus thing. Like they've done that whole thing of like, you take apart, you remove a key part and you're like, well, it's not going to float without this. And then somehow it floats just as well or better. And I think that what the series showed is exactly what the distance is between the Chicago Fire and the Philadelphia Union and teams like the Philadelphia Union that are like, Inter Miami's its own category, but teams that are well constructed MLS teams that can get results in knockout competitions in a way that is repeatable, because that's what the Fire want to be. They don't want to be a team that is successful one year. They want to be a team that is competing for trophies every year. And I think a lot of the names that we talked about, are like, some of them are names that probably will not be here in the future, but I think some of them are just, it's a work in progress. And that is just like the squad has made tremendous strides both internally and externally, but it's still not close to the completed form.
Yeah, well put. And I think that's the original point before we got sidetracked was the cupboard was a little bare at the end of that game, unfortunately. There's a lot of work to do. And people, the thing I've heard from a few folks is like, what is the next step? Like, what should the Fire be targeting in this winter? And it's like, for the most part, depth. Like, you still do need a starter here or there. There are a couple guys who I think you would like to see in more secondary roles. But ultimately, what you need is a great second striker, a fourth great midfielder. I say a great relative, of course, right? But that is a big part of it. We've gotten this far, and I do think we should talk about. There's two things we should really talk about, right? The first is Jeff Gall. Unfortunately, just a really poorly timed performance from Jeff Gall. Like we had talked about earlier, not expected to start. Chris Brady suffers a late injury. He goes in. And unfortunately leads directly, I think, to two of the three goals. I know there's some talk of, was that pass from Romini Kwame off center a better touch on that, even just a slightly cleaner touch on that, and it's not a goal. So it does feel like a really unfortunate performance for him, not long after he gets an extension to ostensibly be the second string goalkeeper for the next few years in Chicago.
Next year, but I feel really bad for Gall. To be thrown. This is very similar, I think, to Rogers in the beginning of the season, when literally he was only put as a starter in the last 5 minutes before the game because Toronto went down injured. Where, if you're in Gall's shoes, congratulations, you're getting your first MLS Cup start against the best team in the league. And they are going to be on you like flies on honey. So, I mean, it was essentially the perfect storm where if you're Gall, it's like, you should have done better, but also just everything that could have gone wrong just in the last 2 days did.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that if it had gone wrong earlier, right? Like if it had been an injury in training on like Tuesday, maybe there would have been more time to talk about the game plan a little bit differently. I mean, when Berhalter said that Gall was informed Friday night, that makes me think that, the situation was up in the air Friday during training, which sort of makes sense, right? Like if he's hurt in training, if Brady's hurt in training on Friday, you don't know if he's going to be available the next day, which meant that there wasn't a training session that the Fire had where they could have discussed if there were going to be changes in like how they play out the back, or if they only do it in certain situations, or stuff like that. And it potentially even means that like that Gall didn't get a sort of like warm-up session of just kicking the ball around with Joel Waterman and Jack Elliott the same way, let alone Kwame and people further up the pitch. I mean, I don't know if that would have made a difference. It was not a good game from Jeff Gall. I think we've seen significantly better games from him. I don't think that the game reflected his overall quality. I do think that goalkeepers behind Chris Brady in the pool are going to be a focus in 2026 because of his performance a little bit, but because of, does there need to be a number two in waiting? If, Chris Brady, I think, certainly has improved his game a lot. He's been getting called up to the U.S. men's national team. And again, we'll talk about this in the future, but I think that is going to be one of the key focuses in a way that like in 2025, I don't think we spent any time really thinking about who the goalkeeper is going to be.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And to that end, right, it's a little bit more about a just in case almost, right? Because I think it was, I don't remember who, but I think somebody said something to the effect of like, Chris Brady signed a contract extension. Like he's happy to be here and be the number one. Clearly that doesn't have any bearing on his aspirations with the national team. But
Chris Brady also signed a contract extension if the Fire are trying to sell him, just,
yes,
or whatever.
Yes,
like, so
the other thing I was going to say is it doesn't really matter because if he plays well enough, an offer is going to come at some point, right? And I don't think we're very far away from that. The other guy, an offer may come for at some point this off season even. And I think, we'll talk more roster stuff later in the window or later in the offseason as we get a little closer. But I do feel worth mentioning this is maybe the last game we see of Brian Gutierrez in a Chicago Fire shirt. And if so, I don't want to say disappointing because I feel like he played pretty well, actually, all things considered, but a missed penalty and certainly a disappointing result and atmosphere to end the game, if that's fair, right? Tim, not going to ask you to report anything. I don't know that there's actually anything to report at the moment, but where do you see that kind of longer term impact? Is that with the injury of Franco, do we think that changes the outlook of Brian Gutierrez in 2026?
Look, I don't know what the plans are around Franco, right? It hasn't really been the time to ask. I think I've talked about this in some things I've written on Minared 97 of, I think it's a very interesting choice that Greg Berhalter and his staff are facing, because obviously the salary that he's earning on loan is not necessarily the salary he would be promised in a new deal, which would happen if the move was made permanent. But he is an absolute steal based on the small sample size of games that we've had. But it's also a position where we know the Fire had targeted like Kevin De Bruyne, right? And like Andre Franco is younger. You will have him for many more years, but he's also not Kevin De Bruyne. And so the question is, where does the front office, Greg Berhalter and the staff that handled that, see that position in the next year when it's likely you won't have Franco for a substantial period or potentially at all? Like we didn't see Ricky Puig appearing for the Galaxy and he was injured later in the year with an ACL. Now, again, we don't know severity and any of that stuff, which can be a huge factor in recovery time. So that's just speculation, but it's a lot of interesting choices. Brian Gutierrez, I think you make the move that's right for him at the time that sort of makes the most sense. And I think that you have to, Berhalter, I think still in 2026 is going to be building the squad for the long term. And I think that you don't make major roster moves in terms of selling a player or in terms of bringing a player over because of a situation that you're going to have potentially for 6 months of no Franco or whatever it is, right?
Yeah. No, well put. Just for timeline's sake, right? You probably don't expect Andre Franco back anything earlier than June. And if we're just being realistic about what an ACL recovery looks like, he's probably not himself until 2027. Right?
I think that, we don't know the severity of the tear, right? And and
I'm being very like the soonest possible I would expect.
I mean, again, like there are players that have come back in 5 or 6 months, right? Which would be earlier, like we'd be talking March then potentially. It's rare. Again, that's why I think speculation. Like you can say on one end he could be playing in the first half of next season in a Fire shirt and looking decent. On the other end of it, he's never the same player again. And I don't think that there's 100% certainty on where you'll be on any of those things, because even if you know the severity of the tear, you don't know exactly how the recovery is going to go. And people that I know that have had ACL tears, depending on what it is and how it is, like there's certain things you can do almost normally. Like we saw Ricky Puig playing, a playoff game with an ACL tear last season, and there's certain things you just can't do. And like, again, it's all out there. Berhalter and the staff need to make a decision in the coming weeks because they need to decide what they're going to do with the loan option that's due, January window. Loan ends at the end of December.
And I would expect to see some of those roster decisions in the next couple of weeks, right? Certainly.
Yeah, I think that they have to announce roster decisions for players that have options and stuff like that in short order so that free agency and all those things can be decided. The Players Association have a list of current probable free agents that they've posted on their website, and teams and players and agents and all that are working around these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said before, we'll have obviously more coverage on the website in terms of when things are actually announced, some expectations, all that kind of good stuff. And then we'll also have hopefully a few episodes here as well, just to keep you a little bit entertained as the off season has officially begun. Although it is nice, starts 2 weeks later. That's not so bad, fellas. That really is not so bad. The last thing, and we can spend as much or as little time on this as you guys would like to. Did want to touch a little farther on some of the fan involvement, we'll say, from last night. We talked earlier about the game being stopped. There was a 3-minute stoppage in the 78th minute. John Freeman then continued play. Tim, please feel free to walk us through the actual rule of this, but my understanding was he very well could have called it not 2 minutes later, as it actually game resumed play with the chant yet again. We've heard from supporters group leaders all kind of saying the same thing, which was this was not regular supporters. This was not regular fans. This was new people coming in, folks who are not necessarily week in, week out watchers. Obviously just a disappointing kind of end to what I think we all feel was a pretty good season overall.
Yeah. And it's just like the complete 180 from just such a positive energy at SeatGeek Stadium against Orlando a week before, where the supporters section just felt amazing. And look, it was still I think that it's maybe a little bit easy to forget how tense that game against Orlando was in moments, right? And the supporters were intense, and I think that that's worth saying. Every single call the ref made in that game, the ref was either cheered like a hero or booed like a villain, right? And I think the reason I'm saying that is there's a way that I think is acceptable to allow that intensity out. I don't think this had anything to do with intensity. It had nothing to do with supporting the team. It had nothing to do with trying to change the game, because you think you're going to get an Andre Blake, one of the best goalkeepers in the region over the past almost decade. You're going to get in his head so much he can't do a goal kick. Come on. The Fire were down 3-0. They hadn't shown a lot of convincing case that they were going to get a single goal. They ultimately didn't. It wasn't about changing the game. It wasn't about intensity. It was just about unacceptable behavior, Yeah,
and even earlier in the game, you had fans throughout the majority of the first half booing Jeff Gall when he touched the ball. And it kind of, look, they're two very different things, of course, right? I'm not going to try and equate the two, but I think it speaks to a larger symptom of that was super disappointing. To have Drew Connor standing in the middle of the supporter section at halftime, yelling and screaming at fans to please stop, because we still haven't, at times it was hey, we got 70 minutes left of this game, and you're booing the guy who has to be in goal the rest of the game. God bless Brian Dowd. He wasn't coming in at half. He just wasn't. Right?
Brian Dowd, I think would not have been an upgrade in any way. For those that have watched him in MLS Next Pro, it just isn't really something that I think would have been a fair ask for him. And so how is that being constructive? Now, maybe, you could say it's, just to, I don't know what, tough love or something like that. Look, but again, I'm not sure that in that situation, I would have wanted to boo Jeff Gall, because it's not like anyone thought that he wasn't trying, right? To me, when I've been a fan in stands, that's when I felt okay booing players for stuff. If it's a player from my team, it's when I think that they're not performing up to their potential. And we've seen that in MLS of some guys that show up. Reports of designated players smoking, vaping, stuff like that. Not in games as far as I can remember, but hey, some of the early DP years, there weren't cameras everywhere yet, so you never know. But I think that's the point where I've wanted to boo guys. But you know what? This is a difference of opinion, right? Between I would have done it, somebody else wouldn't have done it. I think that it's okay ultimately to boo players on the pitch if you don't like something about what they're doing. I don't think that abusive language is ever okay, and I think that's the difference between those two things.
Yeah, 100%. No, you're absolutely correct in that way. As we mentioned, I think overall we're going to look back at the story of 2025 and say, sure, getting swept out of the playoffs stinks, but you got swept out of the playoffs by the Supporter Shield champions and the team that very well may go on to win MLS Cup. So hard to complain too much. But yeah, certainly leaves a sour taste in your mouth as you now get ready for an off season where, we're not going to see anything different until February. Maybe, I guess maybe a little earlier, depending on what happens with the World Cup schedule, because that's happening. But who knows? We'll be out there January 3rd for MLS kickoff, right?
What I'm hearing is, so by the CBA, every team has to have at least 6 weeks off with no soccer related activities, which does sound like a really short off season when you think about it. But I'm hearing that some teams that left early may be asking players to report for training camp as early as the second week in January, which is early.
The Fire did announce they're going back to Coachella Valley, the Coachella Valley Invitational Tournament, which I thought was interesting just from the perspective of like, well, that puts a hard stop on when you would expect the season to start. Although knowing MLS, it's like we'll find out in like January 15th when the season's going to start. And
they
we'll
make
find
things
out
publicly. Teams are aware of a lot of the scheduling things, just as an FYI. But like I think it's going to be a rough 2026 for a variety of reasons. For which is a little disappointing, I think, for a Fire fan, because I think the game was disappointing. I think that there are so many pieces this season that are going to be good to have around in 2026. And I think that just like making some relatively small changes in the Fire will be in a conversation for significantly higher standing in the playoffs. And like, who knows, right? Like what other competitions the Fire will be in next year, because will there be a Leagues Cup? We don't know. Will there be an Open Cup? Will they limit the Open Cup to like, I mean, no one knows any of these things right now. And that's a little frustrating of like, you don't know how your performance in 2025 correlates to the competitions you're qualifying for, but hey, it's MLS.
That it is, Tim. That it is. And look, like I said before, definitely stay tuned to the website and to all our socials, of course. That's where you'll find all the latest updates on all things Chicago Fire and MLS in 2026 as we find things out, as we learn new things. And as we recap what was, I think overall a really good season. You tell me 53 points and a playoff appearance back in January, I think I'd be pretty happy with that. So try and keep that mindset as we move into 2026. I think that just about does it for us, though, folks, or fellas, I should say. This has been, like we said, a pretty wild ride of a season, something like probably 70, 75 episodes on the year. As we are not signing off for the year, we'll have some more content coming in the coming weeks as we kind of recap the season, talk some potential roster moves, recap what the club is doing, and then eventually we'll get into the fun stuff of talking transfers and what, the three guys who sit in their houses and talk about Chicago Fire would do if they were the ones handing out the contracts. But as much as we can say it, thank you so much for joining us time and time again. The season is over. The coverage is not. We will continue through the winter here to talk Chicago Fire. So stay tuned to the socials, to the website, menandred97.com. That's where you'll be able to keep as up to date as possible. And as always, if you can give it a like, a share, a subscribe, all that kind of fun stuff, so that A, we know you're there, but B, other people know we're there as we look to always kind of, grow the culture, grow the fan base a little bit. That goes a long, long way. Tim, DJ, anything you guys want to add before we actually wrap here?
I will add on, this has been the best season for the Fire since 2009. That's all I have to say.
It's a factual statement.
Agreed. And look, we're not going away for very long, so you'll be sick of us soon enough again.
I'm already sick of us.
Yeah, Tim's already getting tired of me texting him like, when are we doing this episode? Because I've got some ideas. Now, but hey, look, as we said before, following all the normal places, and as much as we can say it, thank you so much for joining us around the Bonfire. 2025 was a great year. We're excited about 2026, and come on, you men in red.